Because understanding great literature is better than trying to read and understand yet another business book. On the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, we commit to reading, dissecting, and analyzing the great books of the Western canon. You know, those books, from Jane Austen to Shakespeare, and everything else in between, that you might have fallen asleep trying to read in high school. We do this for our listeners, the owner, the entrepreneur, the manager, or the civic leader who doesn't have the time to read, dissect, analyze, and leverage insights from literature to execute leadership best practices in the confusing and chaotic postmodern world we all now inhabit. Welcome to the rescuing of Western civilization at the intersection of literature and leadership. Welcome to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. Hello, my name is Hasan Sorrells, and this is the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, episode number 80. With our book today, a book which follows on the heels of the biography by B.H. Liddell Hart that we read in episode number 40 about the lifetimes and strategies of Thomas Edward T.E. Lawrence in the wilds of the Arabian Desert during World War I. We have today the words of the man himself, the military autobiography of the Arabian Revolt against the Ottoman Empire, The 7 Pillars of Wisdom by T.E. Lawrence. Leaders never outstay a climax. And we pick up today from the Wordsworth Classics edition with an introduction by Angus Calder of The 7 Pillars of Wisdom by T.E. Lawrence. Picking up from the introduction, we're going to start off here with a little bit of, hopefully a little bit of what will prove to be a little bit of insight into Mr. Lawrence, into what he was about, and kind of get you refamiliarized with him as a character astride the stage of history. And I quote, Thomas Edward Lawrence, born 1888, took a first-class degree in history at Oxford University. His initial interest in the Middle East, which he visited as a lone undergraduate, was in the castles of the Crusaders, European intruders into the Semitic world. As what we would now call a graduate student at the ancient Hittite site of Kar Kamis, he later developed his skills as a leader of Middle Eastern people, as the organizer under academic seniors of scores of laborers on the dig. He also worked more briefly in Egypt and Sinai. So, when war broke out, he was an obvious person to receive a commission as an officer in intelligence attached to the British GHQ in Cairo, center of planning for the Eastern War against the Turkish Empire, which had allied itself with Germany. Despite his eccentricities, which included not drinking alcohol and holding socially aloof from most of the city's British community, he proved a significant asset. Whatever else may be controversial about Lawrence, there is no doubt that he had an acute mind and a great deal of practical ability, both organizational and, as it would prove, technical. He was clever at gathering intelligence, understood men of all nationalities quickly, and had an equally swift insight into the machines which made modern warfare very different from the combats of the Crusaders. For all his scholarly habits and his basic ambition to be somehow a creative writer, he was more than a match in their own territory for most of the serious soldiers he had to deal with. The British had blundered into trouble in Mesopotamia. A large force pushing north from Basra were besieged by the Turks in the town of Kut from December 1915. Attempts to relieve them failed. Lawrence was sent to Mesopotamia in April 1916 on a mission to somehow turn around the loyalties of disgruntled Arabs serving in the army of their Ottoman overlords. But this was not feasible, and while he was in the country, Kut fell, so that thousands of British and Indian prisoners passed into Turkish hands. The war was stalemated on the Western Front, and in the East, the attempt to force a way to the Bosphorus through Gallipoli had failed disastrously. Under these circumstances, it seems sensible to encourage the Arab revolt against Ottoman rule launched by Hussein, the Sheriff of Mecca. His control of the holy city of Islam conferred prestige on this descendant of Muhammad, and his 4 sons, trained in Western ideas but also reared among the Bedouin in the hinterland, might have the capacity to direct a serious revolt. Lawrence arrived in the Hejaz in October 1916. Despite his assertion in 7 Pillars that he attached himself to Ronald Storrs' mission on his own initiative when purportedly on leave, the truth was that he had an official remit to collect intelligence about the Arab revolt, which after more than 4 months seemed to be getting nowhere. The extraordinary narrative of 7 Pillars and the controversies surrounding it begin there. Lawrence's enormous book, it is hard to believe that reading Lawrence's enormous book, it is hard to believe that his involvement with the revolt lasted only 2 years. And then we're going to move a little bit further along to the introductory chapter written by Lawrence himself. The story which follows was first written out in Paris during the peace conference from notes jotted daily on the march, strengthened by some reports sent to my chiefs in Cairo. Afterwards, in the autumn of 1919, this first draft and some of the notes were lost. It seemed to me historically needful to reproduce the tale, as perhaps no one but myself and Faisal's army had thought of writing down at the time what we felt, what we hoped, what we tried. So it was built again with heavy repugnance in London in the winter of 1919-20 from memory and my surviving notes. The record of events was not dulled in me, and perhaps a few actual mistakes crept in, except in details of dates or numbers, but the outlines and significance of things had lost edge in the haze of new interests. Dates and places are correct, so far as my notes preserved them, but the personal names are not. Since the adventure, some of those who worked with me have buried themselves in the shallow grave of public duty. Free use has been made of their names. Others still possess themselves and here keep their secrecy. Sometimes one man carried various names. This may hide individuality and make the book a scatter of featureless puppets rather than a group of living people, but once good is told of a man, and again evil, and some would not thank me for either blame or praise. This isolated picture throwing on myself is unfair to my British colleagues. Especially, I am most sorry that I have not told what the non-commissioned of us did. They were inarticulate but wonderful, especially when it is taken into account that they had not the motive, the imaginative vision of the end, which sustained the officers. Unfortunately, my concern was limited to this end, and the book is just a designed procession of Arab freedom from Mecca to Damascus. It is intended to rationalize the campaign, that everyone may see how natural the success was and how inevitable, how little dependent on direction or brain, how much less on the outside assistance of the few British. It was an Arab war, waged and led by Arabs, for an Arab aim in Arabia. And then a little bit further down, in these pages, the history is not of the Arab movement, but of me in it. It is a narrative of daily life, mean happenings, little people. Here are no lessons for the world, no disclosures to shook peoples. It is filled with trivial things, partly that no one mistake for history, the bones from which someday a man may make history, and partly for the pleasure it gave me to recall the fellowship of the revolt. We found together because of the We were fond together because of the sweep of open places, the taste of wide winds, the sunlight, and the hopes in which we worked. The morning freshness of the world to be intoxicated us. We were wrought up with ideas inexpressible and vaporous, but to be fought for. We lived many lives in those whirling campaigns, never sparing ourselves. Yet, when we achieved, and the new world dawned, the old men came out again and took our victory to remake in the likeness of the former world they knew. Youth could win, but had not learned to keep, and was pitiably weak against age. We stammered that we had worked for a new heaven and a new earth, and they thanked us kindly and made their peace. All men dream, but not equally. T.E. Lawrence wrote in the introductory chapter from which we just read, 7 Pillars of Wisdom. And nobody, I would remind him as well, and he would probably appreciate this if he were around now, nobody gets a quote-unquote vacation from history. The Arab Revolt that occurred during the course of World War I that in effect opened up an Eastern Front on Germany's flank allowed the British and the rest of the Allies, but most particularly the British, to kill what at the time was referred to as the sick man of Europe, the Ottoman Empire. And we're going to talk a little bit about the Ottoman rule and the nature of imperial rule, particularly the nature of Arabic imperial rule today on the podcast. But in order to set the stage, the thing that we have to consider, the thing that we have to really pay attention to, is that this Arab revolt that T.E. Lawrence, in essence, ginned up or maybe participated in or encouraged people to participate in. That's kind of probably how he would frame it. That Arab revolt of World War I effectively moved the Overton window. It allowed things that had previously been unable to be said out loud. Not only said about Arabic people, but also allowed things to be said and to be thought by the British about the Indians, the Turks, the Bedouins, and all other Semitic peoples of the Middle East. The Arab Revolt of World War I moved the Overton window so far that when it came time to make restitution for the ultimate pogrom out of the pogroms that had been happening for 1900 years against the Jewish people on Western European and Eastern European soil, when it came time to render a judgment at Nuremberg, there was absolutely no problem for the British to hand over Palestine to the Jewish people. Without the Arab Revolt, a generation before, Israel doesn't exist today. Remember, nobody gets a vacation from history. And reading 7 Pillars of Wisdom in light of the current Middle Eastern struggles, I'm recording this today in October of 2023, a few days after Hamas decided they were going to renew hostilities with the Israelis from Gaza to Israel. I'm recording this in the backwash of that. It occurs to me that everything once old is now new again. Lawrence, and even the old men who made peace at the end of World War I, would not be surprised by this either. A couple other things that jump out to me about 7 Pillars of Wisdom. And by the way, it's an awesome title. You should go pick up the Wordsworth Classics edition of it with the introduction by Angus Calder, which we read from there at the beginning. A couple of other things occur to me. And the first thing is geography and demography are destiny. If you are living in a particular place with a particular type of people, and I'm not talking about ethnicity, I'm just talking about numbers of people, well, those numbers really do matter, and they matter in controlling your geography and in figuring out what you're going to do. And this is something that Lawrence understood intimately. The Arabs had, at the time of the revolt, a mass of people that really were yearning to be free. And they might have had this yearning. No, not they might. They did have this yearning in spite of the British and in spite of T.E. Lawrence showing up. And all that Lawrence did really was act as a catalyst for forward movement. Now, one last thing before we go to our next selection here from 7 Pillars of Wisdom that you may want to take note of. T.E. Lawrence is a romantic writer. He is a romantic thinker. You don't really get that from the movie that was made about him, shot infamously enough in Jordan back in the day, starring Peter O'Toole. that really set Lawrence of Arabia, or T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, set the image of him as a man in people's heads with those cool blue eyes, and that 1,000-mile stare, and that swarthy skin topped by blonde hair. But that guy, not the character. The guy of Lawrence himself was a romantic adventurer. He did want romance. He did seek adventure, but he did not seek leadership. And this is one of the biggest lessons that we can learn, that we can take from T.E. Lawrence's writing in Seven Pillars of Wisdom. The biggest lesson is how to handle leadership when it is thrust upon your shoulders. All right, back to the book, back to Seven Pillars of Wisdom by T.E. Lawrence. We're going to jump around between the introduction and book 1 today. This book has several parts. As a matter of fact, there are 10 books and an appendix inside of Seven Pillars of Wisdom. So we will be revisiting this at a certain point, but I want to give you enough of the flavor of it so that you feel encouraged to go out and pick it up. Again, it is a book that is well worth your time to read for our current geopolitical era. Chapter 4. The first great rush round the Mediterranean had shown the world the power of an excited Arab for a short spell of intense physical activity. But when the effort burned out, the lack of endurance and routine in the Semitic mind became as evident. The provinces they had overrun they neglected out of sheer distaste of system, and had to seek the help of their conquered subjects or of more vigorous foreigners to administer their ill-knit and inchoate empires. So early in the Middle Ages, the Turks found a footing in the Arab states, first as servants, then as helpers, and then as a parasite growth which choked the life out of the old body politic. The last phase was of enmity, when the Hulagus, or Termers, satiated their bloodlust, burning and destroying everything which irked them with a pretension of superiority. Arab civilizations had been of an abstract nature, moral and intellectual, rather than applied, and their lack of public spirit made their excellent private qualities futile. They were fortunate in their epoch. Europe had fallen barbarous, and the memory of Greek and Latin learning was fading from men's minds. By contrast, the imitative exercise of the Arabs seemed cultured, their mental activity progressive, their state prosperous. They had performed real service in preserving some of the classical past for a medieval future. With the coming of the Turks, this happiness became a dream. By stages, the Semites of Asia passed under their yoke and found it a slow death. Their goods were stripped from them, and their spirits shriveled in the numbing breath of a military government. Turkish rule was gendarme rule, and Turkish political theory as crude as its practice. The Turks taught the Arabs that the interests of a sect were higher than those of patriotism, that the petty concerns of the province were more than nationality. They led them by subtle dissensions to distrust one another. Even the Arabic language was banished from courts and offices, from the government service, and from superior schools. Arabs might only serve the state by sacrifice of their racial characteristics. These measures were not accepted quietly. Semitic tenacity showed itself in the many rebellions of Syria, Mesopotamia, and Arabia against the grosser forms of Turkish penetration, and resistance was also made to the more insidious attempts at absorption. The Arabs would not give up their rich and flexible tongue for crude Turkish. Instead, they filled Turkish with Arabic words and held to the treasure of their own literature. They lost their geographical sense and their racial and political and historical memories, but they clung the more tightly to their language and erected it almost into a fatherland of its own. The first duty of every Muslim was to study the Quran, the sacred book of Islam, and incidentally the greatest Arab literary monument. The knowledge that this religion was his own and that only he was perfectly qualified to understand and practice it gave every Arab a standard by which to judge the banal achievements of the Turk. Then came the Turkish Revolution, the fall of Abdul Hamid, and the supremacy of the Young Turks. The horizon monumentarily broadened for the Arabs. The Young Turk movement was a revolt against the hierarchical conception of Islam and the pan-Islamic theories of the old sultan, who had aspired, by making himself spiritual director of the Muslim world, to be also, beyond appeal, its director in temporal affairs. These young politicians rebelled and threw him into prison under the impulse of constitutional theories of a sovereign state. So at a time when Western Europe was just beginning to climb out of nationality into internationality and to rumble with wars far removed from the problems of race, Western Asia began to climb out of Catholicism into nationalist policies and to dream of wars for self-government and self-sovereignty instead of for faith or dogma. This tendency had broken out first and most strongly in the Near East, in the little Balkan states, and had sustained them through an almost unparalleled martyrdom to their goal of separation from Turkey. Later, there had been nationalist movements in Egypt, in India, Persia, and finally in Constantinople, where they were fortified and made appointed by the new American ideas in education. Ideas which, when released into the old, high Oriental atmosphere, made an explosive mixture. The American schools, teaching by the method of inquiry, encouraged scientific detachment and free exchange of views. Quite without intention, they taught revolution, since it was impossible for an individual to be modern in Turkey and at the same time loyal if he had been born of one of the subject races, Greeks, Arabs, Kurds, Armenians, or Albanians, over whom the Turks were so long helped to keep dominion. The Young Turks, in the confidence of their first successes, were carried away by the logic of their principles, and as protest against pan-Islam preached Ottoman brotherhood. The gullible subject races, far more numerous than the Turks themselves, believed that they were called upon to cooperate in building a new East. Rushing to the task, full of Herbert Spencer and Alexander Hamilton, they laid down platforms of sweeping ideas and hailed the Turks as partners. The Turks, terrified at the forces they had let loose, drew the fires as suddenly as they had stoked them. Turkey made Turkish for the Turks. Yeni Tehran became the cry. Later on, this policy would turn them towards the rescue of their Iridençai, the Turkish population subject to Russia in Central Asia. But first of all, they must purge their empire of such an irritating subject races as resisting the ruling stamp. The Arabs, the largest alien component of Turkey, must be first dealt with. Accordingly, the Arab deputies were scattered, the Arab societies forbidden, the Arab notables proscribed. Arabic manifestations in the Arabic language were suppressed by Enver Pasha more sternly than by Abdul Hamid before him. However, the Arabs had tasted freedom. They could not change their ideas as quickly as their conduct, and the stiffer spirits among them were not easily to be put down. They read the Turkish papers, putting Arab for Turk in the patriotic exhortations. Suppression charged them with unhealthy violence. Deprived of constitutional outlets, they became revolutionary. The Arab societies went underground and changed from liberal clubs into conspiracies. The Akua, the Arab Mother Society, was publicly dissolved. It was replaced in Mesopotamia by the dangerous Ahad, a very secret brotherhood limited almost entirely to Arab officers in the Turkish army, who swore to acquire the military knowledge of their masters and to turn it against them in the service of the Arab people when the moment of rebellion came. It was a large society with a sure base in the wild part of southern Iraq, where Sayyid Talib, the young John Wilkes of the Arab movement, held power in his unprincipled fingers. To it belonged 7 out of every 10 Mesopotamian-born officers, and their council was so well kept that members of it held high command in Turkey to the last. When the crash came and Allenby rode across Armageddon and Turkey fell, one vice president of the society was commanding the broken fragments of the Palestine armies on the retreat, and another was directing the Turkish forces across Jordan in the Amman area. Yet later, after the armistice, great places in the Turkish service were still held by men ready to turn on their masters at a word from their Arab leaders. To most of them, the word was never given, for those societies were pro-Arab only, willing to fight for nothing but Arab independence, and they could see no advantage in supporting the Allies rather than the Turks, since they did not believe our assurances that we would leave them free. Indeed, many of them preferred an Arabia united by Turkey in miserable subjection to an Arabia divided up and slothful under the easier control of several European powers in spheres of influence. Too big, too sprawling, too expansive. Too many people, too many ethnicities, too many languages, too many different conceptions of freedom, too many different ideas about what it meant to be free. There have been very few empires in the history of the world. Of course, everyone talks about the Roman Empire, beginning on the hills of Rome all the way back in the era before Christ, and then continuing on until it washed up on the shores of Constantinople back at the end of the 15th century. Then we talk about the British Empire, right? The sun never set on it, expanding and growing from about the middle part of the 17th century, from the time really they defeated the Spanish Armada, all the way up. And of course, I'm not including the time they were involved in European affairs, but all the way up through the ignominious little rebellion in 1776 they couldn't put down, all the way up to, of course, the 1960s when the British Empire, well, when the sun finally set on the British Empire. And then you have the Ottoman Empire. Those are the three biggies: the British, the Romans, and the Ottomans. Now, of course, people these days will throw in the Americans in there, but the water has not all yet drained out of the bathtub of America in this, the year of our Lord 2023. And so the jury's still out on empire there. But the Ottoman Empire was always infamously called, at least for the last 200 years of its existence, it was always infamously called the sick man of Europe. United by Islam, these disparate tribes, these disparate peoples from the Balkans all the way east to India and north into Russia, south way past the Bosporus and going out towards the Mediterranean. This big geographical flavor basket was never truly united. There was never truly a sense that any one of these, and Lawrence talks about this in that clip that I just read, that any one of these peoples, and just going back to the book here for just a second, he mentioned all of them, right? He talked about the Arab states. He talked about Greek and Latin. He talked about the preservation of Greek and Latin. He talked about the fatherland. He talked about the subject races, right? Greeks, Arabs, Kurds, Armenians, Albanians. The Turks had to keep dominion over all of them and at the same time hold them all down so that none of them would get ideas about overthrowing the Sultan in Ankara or wherever he may have been. The Ottoman Empire couldn't remain what it was for much longer past 1917. There's no way the Ottoman Empire would have stumbled forward into World War II. It had to break apart. The problem is, though, when an empire like that breaks apart that wasn't well managed in the first place, and particularly wasn't well managed at the end, where its decline was driven not by internal factors alone, but was encouraged by outside factors. And from the view of those who hold a more dreamlike vision of the Ottoman Empire, outside agitators, an empire like this could not have stumbled forward into the middle part of the 20th century, much less what we call the 21st century today. The reason why the Ottoman Empire failed, one of the key reasons why it failed, is also one of the key reasons why it took the English Empire so long to fail, and why the Roman Empire, even once it was split into East and West, stumbled along for so long. The Romans and the English both understood something that the Ottomans never fully got. You could either have curiosity, empathy, and planning for the people that you are seeking to conquer and rule. That was the English. Or you can just kind of not care and rule by absolute bloody fear. And that was the Roman Empire. If you don't believe me, just go look at history. Force of arms doesn't do it alone. And religion, and we don't talk a lot directly about Islam on this podcast, but Lawrence will today in 7 Pillars of Wisdom. Islam as a uniting force, just like Christianity was in Western Europe, cannot be denied. Christianity and Islam both come out of a root of Judaism. Now, Judaism is not an evangelizing religion. Jews aren't seeking to go out and make new Jews. If you come to them, fine, but they're not looking for you. But Christianity and Islam are different. They both require evangelization. They require an expansive mindset. They require, dare I say, a revolutionary posture to people's souls. One of the major failures of the Ottoman Empire towards the end was Islam descended into decadence, kind of like what you see right now happening in modern, curiously enough, Saudi Arabia and modern Iran. And, of course, would have happened in modern Iraq, that state cobbled together from the remains of the Ottoman Empire, if the Americans hadn't gone in and meddled 20 years ago. When religion descends into decadence, then belief becomes unbound from meaning, and then everything becomes available to you, from revolution to cynicism to nihilism to passivity. Everything goes on the table when belief is unbound from meaning. The Ottoman Empire was a sick man with a lot of diseases, and it died. It died an inglorious death. Back to the book, back to 7 Pillars of Wisdom by T.E. Lawrence. So I'm reading from the introduction here, and we're going to take a little bit of a turn. I want to talk a little bit about the men. Calder mentioned one of them in his introduction, Ronald Storrs, Oriental Secretary of the Residency. I want to go into Lawrence's description of the men that surrounded him, that gave him the opportunity to lead on this revolt he was planning. And I quote from T.E. Lawrence, "We were not many, and nearly all of us rallied round Clayton, the chief of intelligence, civil and military, in Egypt. Clayton made the perfect leader of such a band of wild men as we were. He was calm, detached, clear-sighted, of unconscious courage and assuming responsibility. He gave an open run to his subordinates. His own views were general, like his knowledge, and he worked by influence rather than by loud direction. It was not easy to decry his influence. He was like water or permeating oil, creeping silently and insistently through everything. It was not possible to say where Clayton was and was not, and how much really belonged to him. He never visibly led, but his ideas were abreast of those who did. He impressed men by his sobriety and by a certain quiet and stately moderation of hope. In practical matters, he was loose, irregular, untidy, a man with whom independent men could bear. The first of us was Ronald Storrs, Oriental Secretary of the Residency, the most brilliant Englishman in the Near East, and subtly efficient despite his diversion of energy in love of music and letters, of sculpture, painting, of whatever was beautiful in the world's fruit. Nonetheless, Storrs sowed what we reaped and was always first, and the great man among us. His shadow would have covered our work and British policy in the East like a cloak, had he been able to deny himself the world, and to prepare his mind and body with the sternness of an athlete for a great fight. George Lloyd entered our number. He gave us confidence, and with his knowledge of money, proved a sure guide through the subways of trade and politics, and a prophet upon the future arteries of the Middle East. We would not have done so much so soon without his partnership, but he was a restless soul, avid rather to taste than to exhaust. To him, many things were needful, and so he would not stay very long with us. He did not see how much we liked him. Then there was the imaginative advocate of unconvincing world movements, Mark Sykes, also a bundle of prejudices, intuitions, half-sciences. His ideas were of the outside, and he lacked patience to test his materials before choosing his style of building. He would take an aspect of the truth, detach it from its circumstances, inflate it, twist it, and model it, until its old likeness and its new unlikeness together drew a laugh, and laughs were his triumphs. His instincts lay in parody. By choice, he was a caricaturist rather than an artist. Even in statesmanship, he saw the odd in everything and missed the even. He would sketch out in a few dashes a new world, all out of scale, but vivid as a vision of some sides of the thing we hoped. His help did us good and harm. For this, his last week in Paris tried to atone. He had returned from a period of political duty in Syria after his awful realization of the true shape of his dreams to say gallantly, "I was wrong. Here is the truth." His former friends would not see his new earnestness and thought him fickle and in error, and very soon he died. It was a tragedy of tragedies for the Arab sake. Not a wild man, but mentor to all of us was Hogarth, our father confessor and advisor, who brought us the parallels and lessons of history and moderation and courage. To the outsiders, he was a peacemaker. I was all claws and teeth and had a devil, and made us favored and listened to for his weighty judgment. He had a delicate sense of value and would present clearly to us the forces hidden behind the lousy rags and festering skins which we knew as Arabs. Hogarth was our referee and our untiring historian, who gave us his great knowledge and careful wisdom, even in the smallest things, because we believed in what we were making. Behind him stood Cornwallis, a man rude to look upon, but apparently forged from one of those incredible metals with a melting point of thousands of degrees. So he could remain for months hotter than other men's white heat, and yet look cold and hard. Behind him again were others, Newcomb, Parker, Herbert, Graves, all of the creed and laboring stoutly after their fashion. We called ourselves intrusive as a band, for we meant to break into the accepted halls of English foreign policy and build a new people in the East, despite the rails laid down for us by our ancestors. Therefore, from our hybrid intelligence office in Cairo, a jangling place which, for its incessant bells and bustle and running to and fro, was likened by Aubrey Herbert to an Oriental railway station, we began to work upon all chiefs far and near. Sir Henry McMahon, High Commissioner in Egypt, was, of course, our first effort, and his shrewd insight and experienced mind understood our designs at once and judged it good. Others, like Wemyss, Neil Malcolm, Wingate, supported us in their pleasures at seeing the war turned constructive. Their advocacy confirmed in Lord Kitchener the favorable impression he had derived years before when Sheriff Abdullah appealed to him in Egypt. And so McMahon at last achieved our foundation stone, the understanding with the Sheriff of Mecca. An old professor of mine back in the day told me something that applies here when we read about Lawrence's descriptions of these men with whom he surrounded himself from the British Foreign Office and other places to plan and execute an Arab revolt. That old professor of mine, the piece of wisdom that he gave is thus: sometimes, Hassan, you have to dance with the ones who brung you. Or, to put it in more postmodern terms, from the elite athlete, endurance athlete, and former Navy SEAL Dave Goggins, who is going to do the work of leadership? Who is going to carry the logs? From Clayton, or his description of Clayton, all the way through his description of Ronald Storrs, Mark Sykes, Hogarth, Cornwallis, and then, of course, Newcomb, Parker, Herbert, Graves, and of course many other men that he did not mention. Lawrence acknowledges that he could not have done what it is that he wanted to do without other men surrounding him to do the things he could not do or would not do, the things he was incapable of taking on. One of the lessons for leaders, and it is a lesson that rings from the book of Gideon in the Bible all the way down to Donald Rumsfeld in the Iraq War. The lesson is this: you go to war with the troops you have. You start a revolution with the people around you. You find the fits because, quite frankly, you may not always be given the pick of the litter. One of the major issues in leadership today, and it is a sign of our individualistic time, is that we want to handpick who we like rather than working with the clay that we have been handed. Leaders, a fundamental idea that's buried here in 7 Pillars of Wisdom, is this idea of seeing people's talents and being able to pull them out from them and to be able to encourage them to explore and exploit those talents in pursuit of your goals, or in pursuit of the organization's goals, or even in pursuit of a higher ideal. Look, the right people, maybe the ones in the room that you have been talking to and dismissing the entire time. And we saw examples of this most vividly when we look at the leadership of Little Crow in episode number 79 in Buried My Heart at Wounded Knee by D. Brown. Or we see it described in the description that Ishmael gives of the men surrounding Captain Ahab in Moby Dick, which we read in episode number 72. Finally, we see what we don't want in a description delivered to us by Nietzsche about his last man in Thus Spake Zarathustra in episode number 31 of this podcast. Leaders. The fact of the matter is, who is going to do the work of leadership and who is going to carry the logs is determined by who the people are that you have around you. Now, the men that Lawrence describes in the 7 Pillars of Wisdom didn't think of themselves as leaders. They just thought of themselves at the time, they thought of themselves as guys just doing a job. And among them were strategists and tacticians. But at least a couple of them, Lawrence included, had to be visionaries. And this is the part where we stumble, because a tactician cannot see the vision. And a strategist often gets the strategy confused for the vision. On your team, you need at least 3 people. You need the visionary, who will hold the doctrine in their heads. You need the strategist, who will figure out the hows. And then, of course, you need the tactician, who will go down in the dirt and do the work of digging the ditch. Who will carry the logs? So we're going to start rounding the corner here. We're going to talk about the unbridled cynicism of Realpolitik. But before we get to there, we're going to pick up back in chapter 1 of the 7 Pillars of Wisdom by T.E. Lawrence. And we're going to talk a little bit, we're going to read actually a little bit extensively from his first chapter. Matter of fact, we're probably going to read all of chapter 1, so hang in here for just a moment. From 7 Pillars of Wisdom by T.E. Lawrence. Some of the evil of my tale may have been inherent in our circumstances. For years we lived anyhow with one another in the naked desert, under the indifferent heaven. By day the hot sun fermented us, and we were dizzied by the beating wind. At night we were stained by dew and shamed into pettiness by the innumerable silences of stars. We were a self-centered army without parade or gesture, devoted to freedom, the second of man's creeds, a purpose so ravenous that it devoured all our strength, a hope so transcendent that our earlier ambitions faded in its glare. As time went by, our need to fight for the ideal increased to an unquestioning possession, riding with spur and rein over our doubts. Willy-nilly it became a faith. We had sold ourselves into its slavery, manacled ourselves together in its chain gang, bowed ourselves to serve its holiness with all our good and ill content. The mentality of ordinary human slaves is terrible. They have lost the world, and we have surrendered not body alone, but soul to the overmastering greed of victory. By our own act, we were drained of morality, of volition, of responsibility, like dead leaves in the wind. The everlasting battle stripped from us care of our own lives or of others. We had ropes about our necks and on our heads prices which show that the enemy intended hideous tortures for us if we were caught. Each day some of us passed, and the living knew themselves just sentient puppets on God's stage. Indeed, our taskmaster was merciless so long as our bruised feet could stagger forward on the road. The weak envied those tired enough to die, for success looked so remote, and failure a near certain, if sharp, release from toil. We lived always in the stretch or sag of nerves, either on the crest or in the trough of waves of feeling. The impotency was bitter to us, and made us live only for the seen horizon, reckless what spite we inflicted or endured, since physical sensation showed itself meanly transient. Gusts of cruelty, perversions, lusts ran lightly over the surface without troubling us, for the moral laws which had seemed to hedge about those silly accidents must be yet fainter words. We had learned that there were pangs too sharp, griefs too deep, ecstasies too high for our finite selves to register. When emotion reached its pitch, the mind choked, and memory went white, till the circumstances were humdrum once more. Such exaltation of thought, while it let adrift the spirit and gave it license in strange airs, lost it the old patient rule over the body. Our body was too coarse to feel the utmost of our sorrows and of our joys. Therefore we abandoned it as rubbish. We left it behind us to march forward, a breathing simulacrum on its own unaided levels, subject to influences for which in normal times our instincts would have shrunk. The men were young and sturdy, and hot flesh and blood unconsciously claimed a right in them and tormented their bellies with strange longings. Our privations and dangers fanned this virile heat in a climate as racking as can be conceived. We had no shut places to be alone in, no thick clothes to hide our nature. Man, in all things, lived candidly with man. The Arab was by nature continent, and the use of universal marriage had nearly abolished irregular courses in his tribes. The public women of the rare settlements we encountered in our months of wandering would have been nothing to our numbers, even had their rattled meat been palatable to a man of healthy parts. In horror of such sordid commerce, our youths began indifferently to slake one another's few needs in their own clean bodies, a cold convenience that, by comparison, seemed sexless and even pure. Later, some began to justify the sterile process and swore that friends quivering together in the yielding sand with intimate hot limbs and supreme embrace found there hidden in the darkness a sensual coefficient of the mental passion which was welding our souls and our spirits in one flaming effort. Several, thirsting to punish appetites they could not wholly prevent, took a savage pride in degrading the body and offered themselves fiercely in any habit which promised physical pain or filth. I was sent to these Arabs as a stranger, unable to think their thoughts or subscribe their beliefs, but charged by duty to lead them forward, to develop to the highest any movement of theirs profitable to England in her war. If I could not assume their character, I could at least conceal my own, and pass among them without evident friction, neither a discord nor a critic, but an unnoticed influence. Since I was their fellow, I will not be their apologist or advocate. Today, in my old garments, I could play the bystander, obedient to the sensibilities of our theater, but it is more honest to record these ideas and actions than passed naturally. What now looks wanton or sadic seemed in the field inevitable, or just unimportant routine. Blood was always on our hands. We were licensed to it. Wounding and killing seemed ephemeral pains. So very brief and sore was life with us. With the sorrow of living so great, the sorrow of punishment had to be pitiless. We lived for the day and died for it. When there was reason and desire to punish, we wrote our lesson with gun or whip immediately in the sullen flesh of the sufferer, and the case was beyond appeal. The desert did not afford the refined, slow penalties of courts and gaols. Of course, our rewards and pleasures were as suddenly sweeping as our troubles, but to me in particular they bulked less large. Bedouin ways were hard, even for those brought up to them, and for strangers terrible, a death in life. When the march or laborer ended, I had no energy to record sensation, nor while it lasted any leisure to see the spiritual loveliness which sometimes came upon us by the way. In my notes, the cruel rather than the beautiful found place. We no doubt enjoyed the more the rare moments of peace and forgetfulness, but I remember more the agony, the terrors, and the mistakes. Our life is not summed up in what I have written. There are things not to be repeated in cold blood for very shame, but what I have written was in and of our life. Pray God that men reading the story will not, for the love of the glamour of strangeness, go out to prostitute themselves and their talents in serving another race. A man who gives himself to be a possession of aliens leads a Yahoo life, having bartered his soul to a brute master. He is not of them. He may stand against them, persuade himself of a mission, batter and twist them into something which they, of their own accord, would not have been. Then he is exploiting his old environment to press them out of theirs, or, after my model, he may imitate them so well that they spuriously imitate him back again. Then he is giving away his own environment, pretending to theirs, and pretenses are hollow, worthless things. In neither case does he do a thing of himself, nor a thing so clean as to be his own, without thought of conversion, letting them take what action or reaction they please from the silent example. In my case, the effort for these years to live in the dress of Arabs and to imitate their mental foundation quitted me of my English self, and let me look at the West and its conventions with new eyes. They destroyed it all for me. At the same time, I could not sincerely take on the Arab skin. It was an affectation only. Easily was a man made an infidel, but hardly might he be converted to another faith. I had dropped one form and not taken on the other, and was becoming like Muhammad's coffin in our legend, with a resultant feeling of intense loneliness in life, and a contempt, not for other men, but for all they do. Such detachment came at times to a man exhausted by prolonged physical effort and isolation. His body plodded on mechanically, while his reasonable mind left him, and from without looked down critically on him, wondering what the futile lumber did and why. Sometimes these cells would converse in the void, and then madness was very near, as I believe it would be near the man who could see things through the veils at once of two customs, two educations, two environments. There's a line in a movie, I can't remember the name of it right now. It starred Matt Damon and George Clooney way back in the early part of the 21st century, in the aughts, I believe, or it might have been the 2010s. And Matt Damon ironically says, or maybe not even ironically, sort of sharply states, I always wondered what the Middle East would look like if no one gave a damn about oil. Yeah. Well, now you know what the Middle East would look like if no one gave a damn about oil. T.E. Lawrence, before he describes his experiences in the desert with the Arabs, says this in the introductory chapter, and we did read it here on the podcast, but I want to go back and read it again in light of what he just wrote in an idealistic fashion. He says, "We were fond together because of the sweep of the open places, the taste of wide winds, the sunlight, and the hopes in which we worked. The morning freshness of the world to be intoxicated us. We were wrought up with ideas, inexpressible and vaporous, but to be fought for. We lived many lives in those whirling campaigns, never sparing ourselves. Yet when we achieved and the new world dawned, the old men came out again and took our victory to remake in the likeness of the former world they knew. Youth could win, but had not learned to keep, and was pitiably weak against age. We stammered that we had worked for a new heaven and a new earth, and they thanked us kindly and made their peace." I don't think he's just talking about the Arab fighters that he journeyed across the desert with. I think he's also talking about the British officers he worked with out of the intelligence office, the ones who gave him reign, all the way from Clayton to Storrs and many more. T.E. Lawrence, and this is an irony, was uninterested in statesmanship. He was uninterested in locking in or in re-edifying the gains that he had made because, as he points out, not in that piece I just read, but in the piece I read before the musical break, that long piece, he was seduced, not necessarily sexually, although when you read that section, the intimations in our modern mind are, of course, to homosexuality, and that has led to recent accusations within the last, 10 to 15 years, as T.E. Lawrence has been re-examined, particularly in the light of current Middle Eastern conflicts. There has been accusations of T.E. Lawrence being a homosexual. I can't comment on that one way or another, nor, quite frankly, do I care. My point is he was seduced, but he was seduced by the desert. He was seduced by the possibility of revolution, as he describes himself. He was seduced by the vision of a new world, a world that would be as clean and pure as the desert, where the Arabs could rule themselves, and where all of this magic would happen. And then, of course, like most visionaries, revolutionaries, romanticists, and idealists do, he ran into the Realpolitik. He ran into the strategists. He ran into the folks playing the great game at a higher level than him. And he was totally and completely out of his depth. The biggest lessons that we can take from this, the introductory chapter and the first chapter of T.E. Lawrence's 7 Pillars of Wisdom, one of the biggest lessons we can take from it, other than everything old being now new again, other than the lesson of not being able to revive a sick man because geography and demography eventually kill it, the biggest lesson does not include or is not wrapped around picking leaders from what you've got available and from dancing with the ones who brung you. The biggest lesson is this: the types of leaders that you need in war, the types of leaders that you need in revolution, the types of leaders that you need during times of conflict are not the types of leaders that you need in times of peace. This is a lesson as old as life, but leaders fail to learn it. Wartime leaders very rarely are Dwight Eisenhowers. They can very rarely make that transition from leading and planning and being the Supreme Allied Commander of D-Day to being President of the United States. That often doesn't work. And by the way, it doesn't work the other way either. So when crises show up, you need a Cincinnatus. You don't really need... dare I say, you don't even really want a Herbert Hoover. Crisis makes different types of leaders than peace does. And a leader bred in peace can very rarely make the transition to running a war or staging a revolution. And this is why systems and organizations, this is why the systems that you're in and the organizations that you're in are so often caught by surprise when a crisis does show up. And they are really caught by surprise by the types of people who wind up leading out of those crises. We saw this most recently in the West during COVID. And I'm not talking about the leaders that have been given claps by the important people like the Jacinda Ardens of the world or the Andrew Cuomos. I'm talking about the leaders in your own family, the ones who were living out their lives, seduced by middle-class safety, who when the lockdown started, when the mask mandates began, when everyone began to be crowded into their house, stood up very quietly, looked at everyone in the family, and said, no, we're not doing that. And then they packed up their Conestoga wagon, metaphorically or literally, and got on the road. The type of leadership that we need in the 21st century is the type of leadership that can act both in peace and in war, because crises will come. We will have them as surely as the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. And all of us cannot be romantic adventurers like T.E. Lawrence, but we can, like Lawrence, have a vision, an idea of what would be better, and then rally people around us to get there without being seduced by the purity of the Arabian sands. And well, that's it for me. Thank you for listening and subscribing to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. If you're listening to this on any of the major podcast players, like iTunes, Google Podcasts, or Spotify, please go ahead and leave us a 5-star review and write a little bit in there. A couple of sentences is good enough. That actually helps us game those algorithms that I was just maybe addressing. And, of course, it helps us grow the show. Tell all your family, tell all your friends, and tell the leaders in your life that you know that need to be listening to this show that this show exists. By the way, if you want to get started on the leadership path yourself, or you know some people who need to go on the leadership path, HSCT Publishing, the home company of Leadership Toolbox and Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, can help you and your team do that. So check out our training webinars, coaching services, and more at leadershiptoolbox.us. We are remote, we're live, we're in person, we're on video, and we've got leadership development solutions for your civic group, nonprofit staff, public sector staff, or even your private sector leaders. And of course, you're going to want to check out our video-based subscription service at leadingkeys.com. That's leadingkeys.com for leadership development on demand. You don't like videos, you don't like training, but you really like the podcast? Well, I would also recommend reading a book. Matter of fact, I'd recommend reading my most recent book, 12 Rules for Leaders, The Foundation of Intentional Leadership. You can get that in paperback, hardcover, or as an ebook on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, Ingram Spark, and any other place that you order books online. Finally, of course, we're on YouTube just like everybody else is. We'd love to have you help us grow the YouTube channel, so like and subscribe to the video version of this podcast on the HSCT Publishing channel on YouTube. Just search for HSCT Publishing, or you can search for Leadership Toolbox and hit the subscribe button. Subscribing helps us grow the show, as it does with the audio, just is the same with the video. All right, that's it for me.